Hello, and welcome to the MVP, the Mass Violence Podcast, the official podcast of the National Mass Violence Victimization Resource Center. I'm Dan Smith, the Director of Resources and Technology, and with me today is a longtime friend of the NMVVRC, Dr. Mario Gaboury. Dr. Gaboury has worked on various projects with us since we became a center way back in 2017. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Gaboury. He is the Dean of the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences at the University of New Haven. He is formerly Deputy Director of the Office for Victims of Crime in the U.S. Department of Justice, and he has more than 4 decades of professional, government, and academic experience. Here's some of that experience. He was a gubernatorial appointee on the Connecticut Victims' Rights Enforcement Advisory Commission, and he serves on the Connecticut Human Trafficking Council. He's also served twice on the advisory board to the Connecticut Office of the Victim Advocate. He was the founding president of the American Society of Victimology, and he's a very well-published researcher and author of the 2010 book, Crime Victims' Rights and Remedies. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Gaboury.
Thank you very much.
To get us started today, I know that you are recognized as something of a historian of the profession of victim services in the U.S. And maybe that's a good place to start. Could you give a bit of history about the victims' rights movement in the U.S. and how activism has affected both the criminal and civil court systems?
Sure. And actually, I think the history is very important, and I'd like to go back to a little bit before the United States
Oh, great.
because I think we need that full perspective. So, literally, this has been developing over 1,000 or more years from very early times. And in fact, if you think about it, and I'm going to be making this, we're not going to spend as much time on this as you might want because 1,000 years is a long period of time. But at the very beginning, you actually didn't have an organized criminal justice system in the sense that the government would be vindicating, victims' rights or pursuing, remedies on behalf of victims. Frankly, the civil justice system, such as it was really the first thing that was created. And this was good from a number of perspectives, right? Victims really were in charge of the system at that point in time. There were some inequities, though, in that, if a victim had a large family or a large group of friends that could literally go out and pursue the offender and mete out justice in whatever way, return property or vindicate their victimization in some way, that was great. But if a victim did not have the resources to do it on their own, they were kind of left in the lurch. In addition to that, there was no governance mechanism to what sort of quote unquote justice was actually implemented. So, there was no such thing as our constitutional guarantee of against cruel and unusual punishment. In fact, many times the punishment was very cruel that was meted out. And so over time, it was pretty apparent that if a civilized society was going to evolve, there was going to have to be some government, intervention or some governance at some point. In fact, I won't mention a lot of historical figures, but Hammurabi, who many of our listeners will have heard about at least at some point in time from early history, created what we all know is called the Code of Hammurabi. And one of the elements of the Code of Hammurabi is actually one of the very first pieces of crime victims' rights legislation, if you will. And what Hammurabi decided was that in order to have a civilized society where there would be commerce and the free flow of goods, etc., so that you could sort of build a society based on a solid economy, that the clans were going to have to swear off the blood feuds that would occur at those times, and they would have to allow the state, right, the code under Hammurabi's governance as the emperor to implement whatever the right remedy was going to be. So if things were stolen, it was the government that would get them back for you. If someone was killed, in fact, this is sort of the beginning of what we would look at today as almost a restitution or a compensation system. There would no longer be the killing of another person, which was what the blood feuds would do, right?
Right.
What they would say is, well, in lieu of that, the affected family is going to get, whatever X numbers of, livestock or land or whatever. And so you go all the way back to that early time, and you see the very beginnings of the justice system. It really catapulted itself during the early development of England. And what was going on at that point in time was that the the government, really, there was an ulterior motive at that point, and in terms of creating the early court system. And here's where we'll see a transition over to the U.S., because frankly we brought a lot of the common law court system from England to the very beginning of the U.S. colonies. Okay, so what was going on at that point in time was that as England was establishing its government and establishing its courts for a variety of reasons, they also needed to acquire tax dollars or revenue of various sorts. And one of the things that they did, which actually was unfortunate, was they decided that rather than offenders needing to pay restitution to victims, that offenders needed to pay fines and penalties to the state. And so it actually became a way in which the early English government, funded much of its operations, particularly in the courts. What happened at this point was the victims were really losing control, and they were no longer prominent in the system. And so, fast forward to the United States, we have the early development of the public prosecutor. In fact, the University of New Haven is located in the state of Connecticut, which is where I'm from, and the state of Connecticut actually had the very first public prosecutor office in the United States. And
How
then
about that?
this quickly took off, and so the public prosecutor began to prosecute, obviously, the criminal cases. And most people are familiar with the criminal court system.
Hmm.
The main distinction is that the criminal court system is, uh, it is the government that is bringing the legal matter forward, that is prosecuting the matter. It's the resources of the government that is, trying to determine what justice is, and like that. The civil system still exists, right? It actually
Hmm.
is very robust in the United States of America. Uh, it is the system that is run by the victim. They have to hire their own attorney. They have to either work with that attorney or otherwise figure out how to fund the prosecution, if you will, right? The pursuit of their case in civil court. And the other major distinction is what you can see at the end of the lawsuit.
Right.
For victims in the civil side, they're in charge of it, and most of what they're going to get would be money to pay for the damages that they suffered. You can't, a private individual can't put someone in jail. That happens on the criminal side. So
Right.
a lot of history in a few minutes, but I think it's really important to understand that distinction goes way back to, the earliest days of the development of the law.
Yeah, that was a fascinating historical overview, and I think the first time someone has referenced Hammurabi on the podcast. So that's a feather in your cap as well. And it's a great segue into sort of the next thing I wanted to talk about, and you touched on it at the end there. The difference between the criminal and civil court systems, and
Hmm.
I kind of wanted to tie that into some of our focus, which is mass violence. And, from what we have been able to learn from our work with mass violence victims, including those folks who are survivors of, so we call them in the NMVVRC large scale criminal incidents, largely because we can't think of a better name for them. But some examples would be the Flint water crisis in Michigan, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. So large scale incidents that cause death and injury and have a very large impact, but have roots or possible procedures that touch on both criminal and civil court systems. The folks that we deal with don't really understand the difference between criminal justice and civil justice, and relatedly, criminal courts and civil courts. Um, and as you've pointed out, one is led by the government, the criminal system, and one is led by citizens or victims themselves, the civil process. Is that, does that have any, like in a mass violence incident in a civil case, who would bring that? Is there some sort of way that people can get together and say, hey, let's all hop in on this together? Or
Yeah. Yeah, very important. And in fact, the thing that I think the thing that's important to just keep in mind as we deal with this particular issue is it's the very same incident that we're talking about, right?
Mhm.
So it is whether it's the individual crime victim or whether it is school shooting or a mass violence incident of another site, or whether it is a an economic or I meant to say an ecological or an
Mhm.
environmental criminal act. It's the same thing that happened, but it's two different parallel processes that have different people who are in charge of making the decisions, and different people and different outcomes that are possible from them. So now, to speak more specifically about the mass incidents,
Mhm.
this is actually very important in the early days of the crime victims' rights movement in the United States. So let me start on what the government side is here, and then we'll talk about the individual or group civil side. So on the government side, very early on, there was an effort to figure out how can we best fund, these programs, these crime victims programs. In fact, the Medical University of South Carolina, which I believe hosts the National Mass
you
Violence Resource Center,
you're correct.
is one of the wonderful recipients. When I was deputy director of the Federal Office for Victims of Crime, we awarded many grants to MUSC to pursue some of this, early research and early crime victims response. All right, so how are we going to fund all this? Well, in many instances, the individual perpetrators of crime may have very, very limited resources. Okay, not always, but very, very limited resources. However, some of the earliest amounts of money, large amounts of money that ended up being uh, put into the crime victims fund, ordered by courts to be put into the crime victims fund to be redistributed for a variety of different reasons. Most of it, 95% of it, goes to direct victims assistance or compensation. These came from corporations who had damaged in the environment, or who had affected very negative outcomes on large populations. So there's a real tie-in to the funding of the crime victims programs today, in the federal crime victims fund, which is where this money comes from. And it funds rape crisis shelters and child abuse programs, and mothers against drunk driving and homicide survivors, and many, many other groups that work with Native American populations and other types of victims. So this is really important, and it ties right into this. When you don't have a simple even though it's catastrophic for the individuals involved, it's not just one individual harming another individual, and really having no funds there that could be used. All right.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
take it over to the to the civil side. That very same thing could have occurred, whether it is the mass shooting event, or the environmental event, which may have criminal ramifications. But you have identified um, either an intentionally wrongdoer, right, the person who actually did something, or
Right.
maybe a negligent party, or a negligent third party that had some standard that they should have adhered to, which would have protected these individuals, or should have protected the community in some way. Very interesting is that in most criminal cases, you do have to actually have an intentional wrongdoing, right?
Mhm.
You have to have what we call mens rea in the
Mhm.
law, right? Uh,
Guilty mind,
the
right?
guilty mind, right? And there are some negligence. There's some negligence in the criminal law, but it's really not predominant.
Hmm.
However, in the civil side, negligence is a very well-known cause of action,
Right,
which can accompany all sorts of other torts, as they're called, or causes of action that have damaged people. So it's very interesting that you could identify groups, and they can't hide behind, well, I didn't do it on purpose, right? Well,
hmm,
no, you were negligent because there was a standard of practice that you didn't adhere to, and because you didn't do that, people were harmed. And particularly when you can find these either organizations that are directly involved, or negligent, or third parties that should have known and could have prevented something, they may have what are referred to informally as the deep pockets.
right.
They- and these are the individuals or the corporations or the large organizations that can be made to pay back specifically harmed individuals, like the surviving families of a mass shooting, for example, or the Flint, Michigan victims, etc. And they could be made to pay those individuals, but they could also be ordered to do other things, like pay towards the cleanup or contribute in civil fines to the crime victims fund, etc.
Right,
So it's the same incident that occurred, but you can have a different you can sort of bring in different parties to be held accountable, and you can identify and recapture funds or capture funds to pay for trying to achieve at least some level of healing, or some level of recompense for what was the wrongdoing.
right. Very good description of the difference between the two systems. Now, to sort of get into some of the experiences of individuals in the criminal versus the civil. On our podcast before, we've talked with several folks whose profession is to provide victim assistance and support during criminal trials. We've talked with folks like Clarissa Whaley, who was involved in the Charleston church shooting and providing support to victims here. But those are, I mean, she is part of the legal system, the prosecutorial system that's run by the government. Are there victim service professionals or advocates who provide similar kinds of services during those civil cases, who can support victims who might be part of a class action, or a large group seeking justice against someone who is negligent?
So that is very variable across jurisdictions and across the various states. And so on the criminal side, you've referred to, every state has, I believe we have some majority of the states, it's probably around 29 or 30, that actually amended their state constitutions to provide for victims' rights. But every single state in the nation has at least achieved the basic, the basic victims' rights that are, required and are delivered through the criminal justice system. And of course, there is the federal system as well, that has the various rights that are assured at the federal system. So this does not occur in the same way in the civil system.
Okay.
Similar to how the individual or group of individuals who are harmed have to move the case forward themselves and hire their own attorney, etc. There's the prosecutor's office and the victims advocates who might be associated with the prosecutor's office or a victim services office within the state are in general not going to. I don't think that they're really. You're going to find any instances of them being involved in the civil case.
Right.
I could
Kind
be
of
I could
not
be
their table
wrong,
to
because
wait.
there is some leeway there, and I'll talk about that. in a bit, but for the most part, that is not going to occur. However, nonprofit organizations that do provide services and support for victims of crime might be able to do that. And in fact, their problem is usually going to be, they're stretched very thin, and there are not enough, resources, so they have to prioritize and they have to be very, very careful. But there's nothing to say that. That a group that supports, sexual assault victim, or you name the type of victim, drunk driving, crash survivors, etc., homicide survivors, couldn't also provide, some support to the victim during the pendency of a civil case. Also, the civil attorney, that office could certainly hire, a qualified mental health professional, or someone, with this background and ability, and and credentialing to provide that support. But as a general rule, that support is not going to be provided by the government during the civil matter.
Gotcha. I mean, that's I think, an important distinction. And I actually, I mean, I didn't know that the sort of nonprofits, and of course, as you mentioned, the sort of suing attorneys, the attorneys for the plaintiffs, could actually provide that. That's important
In
information, I
fact,
think,
they
for folks
should.
to
I
know.
mean,
Yeah,
one of the things this should become part of the standard of practice for civil attorneys, is not to lose sight of the fact that just because it's a different, legal system that you're working in, that the victims should absolutely get the support during the civil trials.
great point. I couldn't agree with you more. Um, One sort of interesting phenomenon that arises sometimes is what I refer to as a dual case, where a crime will be tried by a prosecutor or a state's attorney, in the criminal process that you described earlier, and at the same time there will be a civil case, whether it's a negligence suit or a wrongful death, or something like that, by victims and survivors who band together and bring a civil action. Um, can you tell us about some of the nuances or the inherent challenges that dual cases bring?
So it is the area that really presents the greatest, potential for conflict, and the greatest potential for discord between the prosecutor's office and, the state side of things, and the, victims, or their attorney on the civil side, and that really loops back to the way in which defense counsel are usually defending their cases on the criminal side. Keep in mind that the burdens of proof, and this is something I should have mentioned at the outset, the burden of proof is very different from a criminal trial to a civil trial. We've all heard beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very, very, very high standard of proof that you've got to reach in order to have a criminal conviction. And that's because we're talking about taking someone's liberty and potentially someone's life away. And that's a very serious matter. On the civil side, not that it's unserious, but the fact is, in all likelihood, all you can do is take somebody's money away. So
Mhm.
we don't have that very high standard, the one that we use for life and liberty. It is a standard of preponderance of evidence, which basically means more likely than not. It's like the 51%, standard. So it's a very low standard on the civil side, to win the case. And so what happens on the criminal side is that the defense counsel is looking for any way that they could enter any reasonable, quote unquote, reasonable doubt into the minds of the jury, so that they will find that there is reasonable doubt, which means they will acquit the defendant. And one of the key mechanisms for doing that is blaming the victim and
Mhm.
trying to find ulterior motives on behalf of the victim that they can use. They're usually very, very spurious. They're not. There's no truth or validity behind them at all. But that never stopped someone from trying to enter that level of, potential reasonable doubt into the minds of the jury. One of the ways that the defense will do this if they know that there's a civil suit going on, but even if they just think one is anticipated. So if you're the witness, I would say, well, I understand that you've got a civil suit going here, and you stand to benefit greatly with a financial award from that civil suit. So, isn't that why you're, testifying to these things, and isn't that why you're cooperating with the prosecutor? So, what happens because of that is prosecutors, and this is something that their job is to
To
reach
win, right?
right, well,
Yeah.
to get convictions. Actually, their job is to find justice, but
What that
what that
translates to
what
is
that
winning.
translates, and the reason and listen, there's been a lot of wrongfully convicted people, and there's a whole effort. Our university is very much involved with our forensic science area in getting people acquitted, who were wrongfully convicted. So I'm not trying to discount that part of it at all, and I know that you're not at all.
No.
But what happens is, because so few cases, really only a fraction of all the incidents of crime ever get where someone's investigated, arrested, brought all the way to a jury trial where the ultimate question of guilt or innocence is going to be reached, that it's not unlikely that there's a lot of those cases where conviction is in fact the just result. But I just wanted to
Hmm.
make sure people understand that we're very balanced in the way that we view these things. But what happens is, the prosecutor is very concerned about this, and so it's created conflict between civil attorneys and victims and the prosecutor in these various cases. So what some states have done, and what's the big issue, right? Why can't the civil suits just come afterwards, right? And the problem is that they're usually short statutes of limitations for civil suits to be brought. And so if the criminal case takes a long time, and some of them it can take, if jurisdiction's really backed up, you can have, years pass before cases are brought to trial in the criminal side. And so accommodations get worked out one way or another whenever possible on an individual basis. But there are also states that have looked at extending the statute of limitations or tolling the statute of limitations in certain civil cases to give more time for the criminal case to occur, so that the victim doesn't have to make a very difficult decision between their civil case or cooperating at some level with the prosecutor. So this is the fact that it's the same incident as we talked about before, but it's going to be pursued in two different, parallel court systems, if you will, creates a massive conflict, and it is really something that we all have to pay attention to work it out, so that the victim doesn't end up, disadvantaged in any way.
Right. I mean, so are there circumstances in which a plaintiff's attorney, the attorney for someone who's bringing a civil suit, and a prosecutor would cooperate, share information, or do they try and keep arm's length from one another, do you think?
Well, so when you're talking about any evidence that would be potentially used in a criminal case, prosecutors can get anything that they want,
Hmm.
through subpoena, and they will, and they should. And so, it's not like a level of cooperation like a collusion for negative
Right.
purposes,
It's
right?
not. It's not a conspiracy or
Right,
something
none,
like
none
that. Yeah.
none of that. But if there's evidence out there, in all likelihood, the prosecutor, through their investigation, is going to have most of it first anyway.
Okay.
The benefit for the civil attorney is that, unless a case is sealed, and many of them are, things that are introduced in the criminal case are available subsequently to the civil attorney to use as well.
Okay. So you would know who the witnesses with the good information are, at least.
Yeah, and you would know what the evidence is, what the physical evidence is, etc.
Okay. All right. The last question that I have for you, and this has just been a fascinating conversation, and as expected, you are just sort of a fount of knowledge about how the legal system works. Um, we're seeing mass violence victims and survivors of mass violence events seeking remedies for their losses, whether they be property or lives of family members, and psychological trauma that they've experienced in the civil courts. And a recent example of that situation is what has recently happened in Sandy Hook, which was the site of a massive school shooting many years ago. And nine families of victims have recently agreed to a rather large settlement, I think to the order of $73 million, against the gun manufacturer, Remington. So that it was, from my understanding, it was a settlement, not necessarily a verdict that was reached. Uh, that's an interesting development, and I'm curious if you can give us any insight into whether civil actions like that actually achieve something larger than the $73 million monetary reimbursement that the families got, or is it pretty much just limited to that money?
So, Sandy Hook, Newtown, Connecticut is about a 45-minute ride
Right.
from the university. I'm very familiar, with the town and very familiar with that horrible, horrible incident and that horrible day. The fact of the matter is, these families did heroic things by coalescing and by, one, the public awareness and the stick to itiveness that they showed in terms of fighting back against all odds, frankly, given some of the legal obstacles that they faced. It's just an absolutely remarkable outcome. The monies, I don't have any direct understanding other than what's already out in public about what their intentions would be to do with the money. And there's certainly plenty.
Sure.
There's plenty of individual restitution and compensation and services and all kinds of important things that are necessary for these families. But I get the sense that this group of Sandy Hook parents who, again, are absolute heroes,
Hmm.
are going to, at one way or another, I'm not sure what's going to be in terms of the use of specific funds, but one way or another, they're going to continue to be a platform for advancing um, our legislation, our policy, our preventive efforts to try to bring at some level an end to not only just the school shootings but mass violence in general, mass shootings in general. But obviously their focus is on the terrible incidents of school shootings that continue to occur in the U.S. So in answer to your sort of second part of the question, I actually do believe, and it's thanks to the Sandy Hook families and their heroism and their perseverance to reach this outcome that they reached. I think that you're going to see, more families and more affected communities taking advantage of the ground that they have sort of pioneered, right? They blazed the trail, and I think you are going to see more of this, and I think it's going to have a very good effect. In fact, it absolutely relates back, and I'll close with this. It absolutely relates back to some of the very early beginnings of the civil litigation movement in the United States of America, which was to bring these third parties. Remington, and no one from Remington was in the school when this occurred,
Right. Right.
but
They
but
were.
but
There
their
was a
weapon
gun. Yeah.
but their weapon was. And so what was done relative, right, done, or what negligence occurred, and obviously this is what happened in this particular suit. But I think what you're going to find is that this will now blaze the trail for other communities and other mass violence victims groups to say, we can have this kind of outcome. We can help affect policy. We can affect, prevention. We can promote prevention of these mass violence incidents, whether they are shootings, environmental injustices, or any number of other negative things that occur to large groups of people.
I think that's a great place to leave it. I mean, that's a kind of an important message, and maybe a hopeful one, that the heroic families from Sandy Hook will empower a larger number of folks to seek justice, whether that be in a civil court or in a criminal court. Obviously, if it's as you said, if it's the citizens doing it, it would be in the civil court. Um, but I think that those kinds of, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, those kinds of civil actions and financial penalties against companies are motivating to those
Yeah,
companies.
yeah.
They will potentially change some of their business practices or marketing practices or production practices so as to avoid future judgments.
That is exactly correct, and that's what we've seen over several decades already with the civil justice for victims, movement, and that's what I hope occurs in the future.
Great. Well, Mario, thank you so much for sharing your vast historical knowledge and systems knowledge with us. I think that our listeners will really benefit from hearing you talk about the differences between civil and criminal processes and take away some really important points from what we've talked about today. Really appreciate having you on the podcast.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Sure. And this has been another episode of the Mass Violence Podcast. Thank you for listening.